Hey guys, back again. Up next, The Skeleton Tree, Chapter 10, The Old Road. The Old Road. What does it mean? Stay tuned. The sound comes again. That flat bark like a shot. This time, when I look up, I see a tiny cloud of mist hovering over the sea. A whale is passing. In my hands, Catel the Raven Hunter is open to the same page that Frank read aloud in the cabin. I remember being surprised, even annoyed, that he knew about the Valkyries and warlords. I didn't like to think he was smarter than me. But now the mystery is solved. In his hunt for the man with the yellow eyes, Catel has come across a group of Skraelings camped by a fjord. In a fury, he slaughters all of them. Through the air his sword flashed and whistled, and it sang a song of death and vengeance. It sang like a Valkyrie, one of those beautiful ladies of the warlord. It makes me laugh to read this. That's so like Frank to pretend to know something he'd only just learned. It seemed in those early days he was always competing with me, as though he had to prove himself, over and over, that he was stronger, smarter, better in every way. But when he read, his lips moved, and I could hear him just a little. I saw it as he lay on the bed with the tattered old novel. Expressions appeared on his face for the first time. He smiled. He frowned. He looked proud and disappointed. I decided he was reading aloud so that he could hear the story the way the words connected. "Hey, Frank," I said, "when you were little, did your dad read you bedtime stories?" He didn't look away from the book. "Why do you want to know?" "Just wondering," I said. "I don't remember." He looked at his hand, at the long scratches the raven had made on his knuckles. Then he turned a page and started reading again. I grew annoyed as I watched him. "Why can't you just tell me?" I said at last. "Yes or no?" He sighed loudly. "Look, moron, I don't remember." "Oh, come on," I said. "How can you forget?" He turned to me, dark with anger. "Because I can hardly remember that time at all. I can barely remember my dad back then. But my mom says he did. She says he read to me every night, sometimes for hours, okay?" "Okay," I shrugged. "Sorry I asked." But that wasn't the end of it. Frank stared at the ceiling for a minute or two, tried to read for another, and then started talking again. "She would hear him downstairs. He would use different voices for the people in the story, and if they were shouting, he'd be shouting too. She says it was like listening to a play." That was the most Frank had ever told me about himself. He closed his eyes and let the book fall forward on his chest, his hand folded on top of it. That pose, that peaceful expression, reminded me of my father in his coffin. "Sometimes I think I can almost remember," he said. "I was maybe 2 years old, but I can sort of hear his voice. I wished I knew what stories he read." "What about when you were older?" I asked. "Did he—" "No!" He could have asked about my dad and the sort of things I had done when I was small, but he just held up the book and blocked me out. I sat patting the raven. The sound of Frank reading to himself was faint and whispery. That night ended our first month in Alaska. When Thursday flew out the window, I made the 13th mark on the wall. I dreamed again of zombies. They chased me through the same drowned city, through the black water and neon lights. But now Uncle Jack was in the dream too, staggering among the zombies in sodden clothes covered with seaweed. He chased me with his arms reaching out, up stairways, over rooftops. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't leave him behind. When I woke early in the morning, I was out of breath. It was a cold and rainy day. Frank was already awake, but sitting glumly by the door. Water had worked through the sheets of plastic on the roof and was dripping into the bed. Frank just sat there, shivering, watching the drops grow on the ceiling like tiny, shivery wasp nests. "I'm not going fishing today," he said. "Okay," I told him. "We can fix, but you can go alone." He glowered up at me. "Unless you're scared." Well, how could I not go then? I put on capes and leggings and a hood, took the gaff from the table. For the first time I got to carry the knife. I was a bit nervous about the bear,
but proud to be going alone. Down on the beach, waves were huge, rolling up beside me in big green curls. They roared and leapt along the stones, and fingers of Search reached right to the stranded logs. There was no sign of Thursday. On windy days he sometimes played the raven games, flinging himself through the air, or clinging for as long as he could to the tips of wildly tossing trees, until the wind sent him spinning away. But on this day he had something else to do, his own wild ways to follow. I saw an old refrigerator wallowing in the breakers, and a propane tank slamming on the stones with a sound like a gong. Spray pattered on my capes, but inside them I was dry right down to my feet. I saw myself as Robinson Crusoe in an age of plastic, in shoes that didn't match, with a belt made of rubbery hose, and a cone-shaped hood tied with a bit of old rope. As soon as I reached the river, my heart began to fall. There were no seagulls squabbling over scraps, and there were very few salmon left in the pool. They swam lazily out in the middle, barely moving their fins and tails, just drifting with the current. They reminded me of sad old people I had seen shuffling along the sidewalks in Vancouver. I crouched at the edge and fished a long time, but the only one that I gaffed was barely alive. I saw a salmon tumble backwards over the falls and sink into the pool. Then it rose up like a white ghost. Its fins and tail nearly rotted away, and started swimming again towards the falls. I had to follow it. If I was going to find any fish worth eating, I would have to go up the river into the territory of the grizzly bear. It was not an easy thing to do, and I stood for a long time at the foot of the falls, until I knew that if I waited another minute, I would never go. Then I went quickly, as fast as I could, hauling myself up the rocks at the very edge of the river. At the top I found an old forgotten road. Only 4 or 5 feet wide, it pushed straight through the bushes. Hollowed into the ground were enormous potholes, one after another. Stretching away into the dark of the forest, they had filled with old leaves and fir needles. I wondered where the road would take me if I followed it all the way. The roar of the falls faded behind me as I walked toward the mountain. The river became a quiet, burbling stream split into 3 channels that flowed over gravel and sand. It teemed with birds. Gulls crowded so closely together that I could hardly see water in places. I waded right into the stream. The water was painfully cold and clear as glass, and I could see my feet in their stupid sandals, swollen by refraction until they looked like big white sausages. All around, salmon were struggling upstream, where the water was so shallow they couldn't even swim. They crawled across the gravel with their backs above the surface, their fins so worn away that they looked like Japanese fans, as thin as paper. They thrashed forward and burst, then stopped to rest as the current pushed them back again. Along the banks lay dead ones by the hundred. All I had to do was bend down and hook the fish. I looked for those with the fewest wounds and scars, and, afraid the bear would come along, I chose to very quickly. I cleaned them on the river bank, ripping out skeins of scarlet eggs that I tossed among the gulls. My hands trembled as I worked. I wanted to get off the river as soon as I could, but the salmon would be lighter and easier to carry once they were gutted. When something swooped above me, I got an awful fright, but it was only Thursday. Arriving in a whirl of feathers and wings with his cry of greeting, he landed beside me, and the gulls gave him room. I tossed him the guts of my second fish, and I carried him back down the river on my shoulder. I liked the press of his talons. I remembered my father reaching down to steady me when I was a little kid, his fingers squeezing in that same way. Where the river was shaded by trees, I saw my reflection. It was twisted by ripples and currents, but I was still shocked by the sight. A boy in plastic rags with a raven on his shoulder. 2 enormous salmons hanging from his hands. To me, I looked heroic. I decided that this was how I wanted to go home. I imagined TV cameras crowding forward as I stepped out of a helicopter straight from the Alaskan wilderness. My capes fluttering, my dark raven turning his head. I saw my mother crying, the mayor stepping out to greet me. All the way to the cabin I thought about this, about getting home, of the things I would do, and the food I would eat. I wondered if everything would seem different. I wondered if I would miss Alaska in any way. I actually wondered if I would miss Frank. Near the end of the beach I found a roll of orange tape. It had caution written on it, again and again. Caution, 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 for yard after yard. Thursday played a game of chasing his fluttery end as I walked, but he left me at the edge of the old forest, suddenly flying away without any sort of cry. His wing brushed my face as he flew past. Alone, I went on to the cabin, where I found new sheets of plastic stretched across the roof, weighted down with rocks and branches. Inside, Frank was sitting on the edge of the bed. He wasn't doing anything. He was just sitting and staring. His hair was wet. His capes and boots lay on the floor in a little puddle. On the hand that Thursday had cut, he wore a black ski glove tattered by the surf, so big that it made him look like Mickey Mouse. "What's that for?" I asked, laughing. He didn't answer. "Well, I got 2 fish. I held him up from the sea." But he still said nothing. He didn't even lift his head. "What's the matter?" I said.
"Never mind," he said. "Leave me alone, will you?" "But just leave me alone." He flopped down and rolled his back towards me. I thought, okay, I'm not going to miss Frank when I get home. In the evening, the wind began to rise, and it just kept rising. Lightning flashed through the forest, and thunder boomed far away. The surf became the footfalls of giants, thumping on land. Though sheltered in the forest, the cabin shook so badly we thought it might break apart. The plastic sheeting flailed and flapped. Raindrops driven sideways by the wind pelted the walls like handfuls of pebbles. Water poured through the roof in rivulets. Frank's repairs had made no difference. In the flashes of lightning we saw drops falling, and we saw ourselves then, too, sitting in the plastic and shivering from the cold. We looked up at the creaking of the trees, expecting one to come crashing through the roof and squash us. I worried about Thursday, and wished he was with me. I hated to think of him hunched in the dark, alone and afraid as he tried to keep warm. Then I thought of the skeleton tree, and how its branches would toss and bend. I pictured the coffins rising and falling, and the skeletons shaking inside them. "This might go on for days," I said to Frank. "If we can't go fishing, we might starve." "It'll be calm by morning," said Frank. In the dark, he was invisible. "The bigger the storm, the sooner it ends." He was right. The ending came well before dawn, with a shriek of wind like a human cry. Then everything fell silent, except for the booming of the waves. We heard the little plops of water dripping from the roof. For once, Thursday didn't wait until daylight. He cried out with a cow-like caw as he came through the window. It was so dark that he might have been a phantom, but his talons clicked on the floor as he landed beside me. "Chase it out," said Frank. "No!" The raven shook himself, spattering beads of cold water. "He's freezing!" "I don't care. I don't want that thing inside." "Why?" "It gives me the willies, okay?" "The willies?" That sounded funny coming from Frank. "Oh, the bad omen thing," I said. To my surprise, Frank agreed. "That's right," he said. "It thinks I'm dying." "Why would he think that?" I asked. "Just get rid of it," said Frank. "If you don't do it, I will." I couldn't see a thing in the cabin. Not the raven beside me, not Frank across the room. From Thursday's throat came little gargles and mutters. He could see Frank. I was sure of that. I heard his feathers rustling, and I was afraid he was going to fly up at Frank and attack again. "Okay," I said, "I'll put him out." I groped across the floor, trying to find Thursday. "I'm sorry," I told him. "You just can't stay." "No!" shouted Frank. "Wait a minute!" The raven was twitching. I wished he would suddenly start speaking real words. "Oh, please let me stay." But he only made his sad sounds, which to me meant exactly the same thing. When I closed my hands around him, he took my fingers gently in his talons and pried them apart. It made me sad that he didn't want to be held. But then he twisted his neck, opened his beak, and dropped something hard into my palm. It was made of metal, cold and wet. I stood by the window trying to find even a tiny gleam of light. "What are you doing?" asked Frank. I couldn't quite see the thing the raven had given me. It felt like a hollow tube, a little smaller than a lighter, with a wire ring to hold it by.
Something rattled inside it. When I turned my hand, I suddenly knew just what it was. "I think he brought us matches," I said.
"What?"
said Frank. I fumbled the cylinder open. Wooden matches came sliding out. They fell through my fingers and onto the floor. I knelt down to find them, groping through the old wet ashes. "Clever bird," said Thursday. But there was no reward for the raven. Frank leapt up to drive him away. He staggered over the stones in the fire circle, shouting that he would kill that bird. Poor Thursday battered at the window, then vanished through the plastic pane. Frank stood panting in the ashes. I pushed at his leg, yelling at him to move. "Your foot's on the matches," I cried. "You're breaking them, Frank." There were 9 matches trampled on the floor, all broken and useless. But minutes later we sat in blazing light. Smoke rose to the roof and steamed through the little hole, and wood crackled and split, flinging embers. We sat very close to the fire, Frank holding the cylinder in that ridiculous big glove.
"6 matches," he said. "That's not very many."
"Don't blame me," I told him. "It's your fault."
"It's your fault," said Frank. "You fumbled the radio when Jack threw it to you. Now you fumbled the matches."
He added wood to the fire until I had to back away to escape the heat. But he stayed where he was, so close to the flame that steam rose from the fingers of his black glove. As I lounged in the corner, Thursday appeared again in the window. His little eyes looked down at us, reflecting orange and yellow. "He's not afraid of the fire," I said, hoping Frank would invite him down. He must have sat right here with the cabin guy. He must have learned that matches start fires, and he just wanted to be warm. He wanted us to be warm. Frank stared into the flames. The firelight made his eyes look black and hollow.
"So where do you think he got them from?"
he asked. "I guess they used to be the cabin guys," I said. "Thursday likes shiny stuff. He probably took them and stashed them in his nest."
"Or another raven did,"
said Frank, nodding. He had it all figured out already.
"That's why the guy killed one, so he could hang it up as a warning."
He put a stick into the fire.
"But there's another possibility."
"What?"
"Figure it out, Einstein."
I thought for a moment, then looked towards the door. "You think the guy's still out there?" Frank only shrugged. "No, that's too weird," I said. "He'd have to be a crazy old hermit to be hanging around like that." I wasn't sure if Frank really believed the man was out there. He just stared into the fire. That day we ate our first hot food in Alaska. Seaweed boiled in water, in the cabin guy's old pot, and fish that tasted smoky and warm. Thursday came so slowly down to the floor that even Frank didn't notice until the raven was right there beside me. Then he laughed.
"Oh, let him stay," he said. "Who cares?"
I fed Thursday scraps of fish, and he joined in the conversations with the strange little mutters and head tilts and shuffles. I wanted to try out the cabin guy's stove, but Frank said I'd be wasting fuel.
"We'll need the gas later,"
he said.
"We can build a beacon, and when the airplane comes, we can pour the gas all over it and make a huge fire."
He may have invented that idea right on the spot, just as a reason to stop me from lighting the stove. But it became his new scheme, and he talked about it as we basked by the fire. Like lizards on sun-heated stones, his last great idea, to climb to the mountain, had been forgotten, and that was fine with me. We drank tea made of hot water and fir needles, and I thought it was the best tea I'd ever tasted. Before the sun went down, I learned that having a fire meant a lot of work. We had already burned up the wood the cabin guy had left, and it would be a steady job to gather more. It would become my job, and I would forage a little farther every day, learning what would burn well and what would not. That old bark from the beach would smolder like charcoal, keeping us warm all night. I got up early in the morning, eager to see what had washed ashore. Thursday came with me. The surf was high and roaring, the waves flinging spin-drift as they stormed across the stand. I saw the dashboard from a car, a Lego brick, a doorknob on a chunk of wood, the plastic head of a garden gnome rolled in the surf, its beard a tangle of barnacles. The only thing I picked up was a tiny shoe that a baby had worn. It was sitting upright on the sand, a little brown shoe with white lace still threaded through the eyelet, still tied in a careful bow. Of all the things I'd seen, this was the saddest, and I couldn't leave it behind. The sole was not even scratched, because the shoe had been worn by a boy too young to walk. I pictured him smiling at those shoes as his mother tied the laces. I could see him trying to touch them, bending his little legs and stretching out his arms, his mother laughing. But it was my own mother I saw, her hair and eyes all shiny, her smile making wrinkles around her eyes. Thursday pecked at tiny crabs and sand fleas trapped in rolls of kelp, but he stayed nearby, and he came right to me when I called. It was a comforting sight to see smoke wafting from the forest when I turned to go back. I could see Frank out on the point below the skeleton tree, where the waves were bursting into high white plumes. He was standing at the edge of the rocks, wrapped up in the plastic cape. He looked like an ancient sailor, longing for the sea. I took the brown shoe to the church-like meadow, up the path and past the cabin. The spot where I'd buried the purse was already healed over, and I couldn't find it exactly. The moss had stitched itself together, hiding my secrets so well that I wondered if anyone would ever find them. I liked the idea that they would vanish. As I buried the shoe nearby, I felt as though I was staring at a cemetery for children who would always be lost. The quiet forest reminded me again of my father's funeral. I remembered how men in dark suits had lowered his coffin a little way into the ground and then let it hang from straps as everyone wandered off. My mother put her hands on my shoulders. She was wearing long black gloves with blue buttons. "We have to go, Christopher," she said, starting to pull me back. I shook away from her, determined to stay with my father. I wanted to wait until he was properly buried, and then to wait some more because it didn't seem right for everyone to go and leave him alone. Uncle Jack tried to lead us away.
"The car's waiting," he said.
The men in dark suits looked at their watches. Over by the cemetery wall, 2 men in overalls were leaning against a yellow excavator, waiting to fill in the grave. One of them was smoking a cigarette. Uncle Jack said,
"It's time to go. We have to leave."
My mother sighed sadly. "Oh, Christopher, please don't do this." I looked up and saw she was crying, so I took her hand and Uncle Jack rushed us away. He bundled us in the car, then told the driver,
"Okay, let's go."
At the gate we stopped to let a taxi pass, and the only sound was Uncle Jack tapping his fingers nervously. In the taxi sat a woman with a veil, with a boy beside her, and they looked terribly sad. I couldn't stop thinking about my father. For days and nights I kept seeing him lying on his back in that dark box under the ground, his hands crossed over his chest, that strange smile stuck on his face. Those memories flashed in my mind as I crouched in the forest. It was Frank's shouting my name that snapped me out of them. I hurried to meet him before he could see my little cemetery. He had brought the gaff, and we went together towards the river. We heard the waterfall from a half-mile away. It rumbled like an enormous engine, and plumes of spray drifted high above the trees. Swollen by rain, dirtied by silt, the river blasted over the lip in a curl of foam like a wave on the ocean. Though right beside me, Frank had to shout,
"We can't get up the river."
I nodded and pointed to the side of the falls. "You climb the rocks. There's an old road at the top."
"A road?"
he yelled. I nodded again and showed him the way. The river spread right over the rocks and the roots where I'd climbed before, but we found our way up at the edge of the forest. When we reached the old road, Frank's eyes became huge. He dropped to one knee and pressed his gloved hand into a pothole. He said something I couldn't hear, then stood up and grabbed my shoulder in that big glove, pulling me close.
"Footprints,"
he shouted. I didn't understand. Frank looked at the trees that stood beside the road. He walked to one, reached up as far as he could, and plucked from the bark a little clump of animal hair. I didn't hear what he said as he jabbered away, but I could see for myself what he was trying to tell me. My road was not a road at all. It was a bear trail, a bear highway, where generations of grizzlies had worn hollows into the ground. They had stood up to scratch their backs on trees more than 7 feet above the ground. The river had climbed from its banks to surge among the trees. Dead salmon tumbled past in endless numbers. They went headfirst and tailfirst, somersaulting by. But others still fought their way up to the edge of the river, resting in little pools behind tree roots and stones. We pulled out 11 fish. We threaded them into bundles and hoisted them into our backs. And for the first time I carried more than Frank. That made me proud, but a little frightened too. Though I was getting stronger, Frank was getting weaker. At the Reepicheep, he had to stop and rest, and he actually fell asleep on the cold stones with his injured hand shoved into his jacket. I watched the waves roll onto the beach, their tops streaming foam as they curled and broke. There was line after line of breakers, and out in the middle I saw a man swimming. I couldn't believe it at first. He rose on a wave, then disappeared, and I stared out for a long time before I saw him again. Now a little closer he tumbled in the foam. It was a man, but made of wood. His arm reached through the air, then sank into the sea again. He tilted on a wave and fell back down. He floated on his back, then he floated on his stomach. I could almost imagine that he was alive, struggling to reach the shore. I stood up to watch, and I saw his face calm and peaceful, his head ringed by oily sheen that looked like a halo. Then the breakers tossed him high in the air. They rolled him towards me, and I pulled him away. I wanted to wade out and grab him, but the surf was too high, and I was scared of the undertow, of being sucked out to sea. The woodman surfed feet first down a wave on his back. His heels grounded in the shallows, and the wave lifted him up till he stood in the sea. For a moment he balanced there, standing in front of me with the surf at his feet, holding out his hand as though to lead me away. Then he fell slowly back and swam out to sea again, and I was left standing on the beach looking sadly after him. I went back and woke Frank. I sat right beside him, still watching for the wooden man. Frank yawned and rubbed his eyes. He scratched himself like a chimpanzee, yawned again, and gazed around.
"Hey, look who's coming," he said.
On the beach to the north, the grizzly bear was plodding towards us.
"He's crossed the line," said Frank. "He's in our territory now."
His head swaying slowly, its great hump rippling above its shoulders, the bear came along at its same steady pace, not caring what lay in front of it. Sandpipers fled from its path.
"This changes everything."
Frank stood up. That terrible smile came slowly to his face.
"There's no choice now. We'll have to kill him."
"What?" I said, "You're crazy."
"No, that's the way it has to be."
Frank didn't look away from the grizzly bear.
"That's the law of the jungle."
I laughed like a lunatic.
"It's true," said Frank. "He invades our territory. We have to kill him. There is no choice. It's him or us."
I couldn't believe that Frank was serious. How did he imagine we would kill a grizzly bear that weighed 1,000 pounds with a gap and a jackknife? He was really out of his mind. Every moment that we sat there talking, the bear came closer. Each step brought us another yard along the beach. In 15 minutes, it would reach us.
"Come on,"
said Frank. To my huge relief, he picked up the fish with his good hand and started on his way. He didn't even glance at the bear, but I kept looking back. It stayed exactly the same distance behind us, plodding over the stones.
"We could make some spears," said Frank. "We could sharpen sticks and forge them in the fire."
He kicked a bit of wood, sending it skidding over stones.
"If I could find some stuff, I could make a crossbow."
The thought of killing a grizzly bear excited him.
"We could dig a hole and put stakes at the bottom," he said. "A Bengal man trap. I saw it in a movie."
Rain started falling in big, heavy drops. I listened to the tiny crabs scuttling away in front of us, as though a stream was flowing under the stones. As we came to a turn in the shoreline, I looked back and saw the bear, still lumbering along behind us, but not quite so close anymore. When we climbed to the cliffs and looked down, I couldn't see him at all.